Welcome to another episode of Working the Word. And in this series, we are exploring the Gospel of John and learning what he pictures who Jesus is. Today, we're going to be looking at chapters 15 and 16. And these are a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples after the meal in the upper room.
Sort of in the last day or so of I was going to say his life, but spoiler, he comes back. But in sort of, this is sort of his last sitting down having an intimate conversation with his disciples before everything happens.
Mm-hmm. So they've had the Last Supper in the upper room. Mm-hmm. And one gets the sense that went into the evening. And then Jesus, at the end of chapter 14, said, "Rise up, let us go from here."
So there's a bit of a natural stopping point at there. We don't get a lot of the details as to, their movements through the night. But, in the other Gospels, we get a lot more information in sort of the final week. We get very little in John from that. But the other Gospels don't really give us a lot in the final night, which John gives us. So.
And we find in chapter 18 and verse 1 that then they went out, and we're assuming that that's out of the city to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is betrayed.
Yeah. I mean, if 14 ends up with, rise up, let us go from here, it seems a bit weird to have like 3 chapters worth before they actually get out the door. I mean, it's possible, but...
But certainly at this point, Jesus and his disciples are walking the streets of Jerusalem.
But the conversation is still really, really carrying on from what's been coming before. It's not just sort of, okay, so now we're going to talk about new things.
But a lot of it is designed to set the disciples up for what's about to happen, to forewarn them. If you know something's coming, it's not such a shock. It's still bad, but you will recover from it.
I think that there's a couple of layers in that, like particularly at the end of John 15, he addresses that a little bit more. But we've also got the aspect that John is writing this from the perspective of a persecuted church. Mm-hmm. So not only is there significance in that Jesus warned the disciples that, immediately there is going to be some kickback and some persecution, but he's also writing from a church much further where this has been a reality for a while. And the fact that Jesus is, tells them at this point that it's coming, I think there's a reason that John really specifically includes it in what he's writing.
So we've had Nero and we've got some other not so nice emperors. And John passes on that which Jesus gave to them in their time of crisis. But he begins with an interesting discourse, one on an agricultural theme. I guess we had a cup and all that sort of thing, but he talks about and he says, "I am the true vine."
There's a couple of ways you could take this, in that, the true vine could imply that there's a bunch of false vines out there, which, the other aspect is that through multiple kind of Old Testament references, we sort of get the idea that Jerusalem and Israel, the vine is one of their symbols. Mm-hmm. Like at one point, some of the Maccabean coins actually had vines printed on them, that this was a symbol of Israel. It's mentioned in Psalm, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea. There's quite a few places where it's, and in Ezekiel 15, the title of chapter 15 is Jerusalem, a useless vine. So you could, there's false vines, but we could also take it here that, being the true vine is the fulfillment of what, God was supposed to be revealing through Jerusalem. And that didn't work. Jerusalem was apparently a bit of a useless vine, and Jesus coming as sort of an actual fulfillment of what was supposed to be that influence.
And as we go, we will discover there are useful and useless vines. Mm-hmm. here is one of his I am statements.
But there's two in this sort of section, and these ones almost seem to be setting up like, yes, I am, but I am in relation to Father, and then I am in relation to you. Like that there's now starting to be sort of some structure in there.
And he gives his father a role in the agricultural enterprise. That he's looking at the branches on this vine as to whether or not they're bearing fruit or not. And the ones that aren't bearing fruit, get chopped. The ones that are bearing fruit, snip. The pruning is necessary.
And that, it's a known agricultural thing. I think it's, can't remember the actual term for it, but, in growing grapes, often they will go through and cut a whole bunch of the green bunches off so that the bunches remaining can be sweeter and juicier, and, the plant can focus all its energies on those bits rather than trying to do all of the, sort of doing lots of mediocre.
They'll go and trim a lot and then roll on some so they'll have good fruit. In verse 3, he's quite plain with them. Already you are clean. He did talk about it in chapter 13.
It's from the katharos, which is sort of the bigger root, but this specific katharoi, we get it twice in chapter 13 where he's talking about, you are clean, but not all of you, because Judas is here. In this instance, Judas is clearly gone, so he's able to say that. But it's also the word that's used when Jesus is speaking in Matthew, when he says, blessed are the pure in heart. Like the pure is the same word here.
Okay. And the cleanness is by reason of the word that he has spoken. That if they've been listening, if they've been following his words, believing his words.
And there is a transformational aspect to, the hearing and believing part of it, that, it transforms.
And so having been considered by Jesus to be clean, he then goes on, and there's a word that's going to come up over and over and over. That
at least 9 times.
Having arrived at being clean, he says you need to abide, which is an ongoing sort of concept. Abide in me, and I in you. There's that two-way transaction happening here.
And often when we're talking about abide, we don't sort of see it so much as that two-way. It's either asking him to abide with us or us, trying to. It's not a like connection. It's the relational part of this, I think, is one of the really key parts, and it's sometimes a bit overlooked with the whole, abide.
And so he goes on, he talks about, a branch can't bear fruit of itself.
Well, if you cut the branch off, it's not
going to flower and bloom. It's got to retain that connection to the vine.
And the fruitfulness of it is in the remaining connected, not in trying, pushing yourself harder to be fruitful. It's in remaining connected, and, the source of the fruit is Jesus working through. It's not I have to try harder kind of setting.
And so he goes around it again. I am the vine, that's what he said last time. But this time, instead of talking about his father, he says, you are the branches. There's no question what he's talking about here.
And we've got, particularly in the last chapter or so and the next chapter, we've got a really strong, he's been talking for a long time about, his connection to the Father. And in these sort of few chapters, he's really sort of bringing the disciples into that almost hierarchy, that, yes, the connection he has with his Father is similar to the connection that they are to have with him. And so, you know, based on what he's been talking about all through John, with the I and the Father are one kind of concept, he's starting to kind of bring them into this story.
So the one abiding in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. And John really doesn't elaborate on fruit in the way that Paul does when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. But he is going to talk about the Spirit fairly shortly. So one wonders if that's what he had.
Well, I mean, it could just as easily be that the fruit in this case isn't the emphasis, because this is sort of the early strong introduction to the Holy Spirit. Like, we don't get a lot in terms of, you know, Jesus talking about the Holy Spirit, why he's coming, what he's coming to do. This is sort of one of the early introductions to it as a concept.
We touched on it in chapter 14.
We touched on it a little bit last week. He sort of promises it, you know, talks about peace, you know, talks about the vine, and comes back to the Holy Spirit shortly. But I think the aspect is more focusing on the relationship and staying, you know, abiding in the vine. And if you do that, then the fruit will naturally happen. It doesn't, you know, this part of the process has to take precedence over fruit as such.
I think that's his point, that this is a process rather than a point.
Particularly as we're about to come to, you know, at the end of this chapter, and the next chapter particularly, it's going to highlight some of the places where they don't abide. And yet there's still, like, you know, the abiding is an overarching, even if, you know, the disciples kind of get skittish and run away for a little while, that it's not necessarily a permanent cut.
Split, yeah. He reminds them in that verse, apart from me, you are able to do nothing. It's a simple agricultural fact that has spiritual lessons. To emphasise his point in verse 6, if anyone does not abide in me, you can be clean, but if you don't abide in that relationship, he talks about being thrown out like the branch, and it's dried up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and it's burnt.
And there's a couple of, like, I don't know whether he's making direct references here, but there's a couple of the passages that sort of, you know, in talking about it as the useless vine, like, you know, if it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be made into something useful? In that, like, a lot of, you know, if a branch falls off a tree, you can often kind of make it into something useful, whereas the vines is not really much, there's nothing useful to do with them. Just throw them into the fire, there's nothing.
And so he goes around it again. Apparently this abiding concept is a very important one. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, that two-way again.
But often the next part of this is quoted without that context. And I think that context is really, really critical in this, because you shall ask whatever you wish, and to you it will come to pass. Out of context could be used in some very manipulative ways.
Give me.
Whereas this concept of, you know, if you are abiding in me and my words are abiding in you, and that connection is strong, then, you know, that's the source of, you know, that will influence what you're asking for.
And in that case, you can ask, and it will come to pass. In fact, in verse 8, he says, in this, my Father is glorified.
And up until this point, most of the time when he's talking about glorified, it's, you know, I have glorified the Father has glorified me. And again, we're bringing into this that, you know, the disciples are now part of this relationship, that in their actions, they can bring glory to the Father in the same way that Jesus has been.
Mm-hmm. And the in this seems to be in the bearing of fruit. And in the being my disciples, learning from me. Those seem to be just tacked one after the other.
And there's almost a bit of an implication, particularly back in verse 6, those who don't abide in me are thrown out like the branch. Sort of implies that there has been a connection at some point, but the belief or, the actions are showing it to not be genuine. And I kind of wonder whether there's sort of, the warning isn't, if you're a bad branch, I'll cut you off. It's more that you need to stay connected, or, you're going to be in name, but a dead branch on the tree, and it's going to look like you're connected to the tree, but you're a dead branch on the tree, basically.
And now he extends this abiding concept. And he repeats it. We've almost got a triplet here. As the Father has loved me. And he's talked about the love of the Father. With that same kind of love, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. It's not a, go independent, go your own way. Know that you are loved and abide. Stay there. If you keep my commandments, you will. And here's that phrase again, abide in my love.
But then, it's not something unreasonable it is asking us to do that he hasn't done himself, because if you'll keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love, as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. This is this is just the way that this family works. It's not I'm forcing you to do all these things or I'll cut you off.
In fact, back at the end of chapter 14, that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father has commanded me, thus I do.
Well, one of the focuses all the way through John has been that, I don't do anything of my own. I do what the Father tells me to do.
And it seems the disciples don't do anything of their own. They do as they have learned from him because they're abiding in his love.
And in the last chapter or so, at some point, Jesus said something like, you will go on to do greater things than I have done here. But the critical part is that abiding in him, not just sort of, woohoo, we're going to do great things and going off and kind of getting stuck on your own.
And making an ego trip.
Yes. And I think some of the things that Jesus is talking about here, particularly as we go on, that, the love isn't about puffing up. It's not necessarily that in order to show love, you have to, impress people or, grand gestures or even lay down your life for them. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but there's an element of self-sacrifice that is involved in love that Jesus has clearly demonstrated and modelled.
And is about to model in a much bigger way.
And they need to understand it in the concept of that love and being willing to do it as opposed to it being done to him, I think.
And that this is the way of joy.
Which is not instinctively normally the thing this is, in a few short hours, he's about to be arrested and very, very brutally treated, killed, etc. And yet, these things I've spoken to my joy. So I have joy at this point, and that my joy can be in you to the point of you have enough and overflowing. It's kind of in hindsight, it's not typically the way we'd expect to see that conversation go.
But he's very clear that he wants them to know that joy is there in abiding in his love.
And I think it also sets it up because he's about to go on to some more difficult concepts. And abiding in the love needs to be the prerequisite for that as well.
We could have jumped to the conclusion, let me just go back one. This commandments and my Father's commandments, some have jumped straight from there to the 10 Commandments. But in verse 12, he actually gives to us explanation. This is my commandment. This is what I'm talking about.
Yep.
That you love one another as I loved you.
And I think that is one of the qualifiers that we really need to have as a strong emphasis here, in that it's not, like in other places we have the, love your neighbor as yourself kind of thing, but this is stepping that up. It's not just sort of, being generally pleasant in the name of, being a good Christian kind of thing. It's you love one another as I have loved you. That is really upping the game.
And in verse 13, greater love has no one than this, that one should lay down his life for his friends. And we're going to see him in the garden when they say, we're looking for Jesus. Well, if I'm the one you want, let these go. That he's there with their best interests at the top of his list.
And even though, he is their rabbi and they're the ones supposed to be serving him, and we'll get a little bit more into servants in a moment, but that, as the leader, he is the one who's actually willing to sort of, no, leave them, I will stand up and take this, just let them be safe.
And I guess we introduced this back in chapter 13, where he loved them all the way to the end. He got down, he washed their feet. Because that was a point of resistance for them.
And even, he talks about Judas, there's Judas betraying him and he still treats Judas with love. There's, he predicts Peter denying him. And his thing at that point is to comfort Peter. He's going through very real emotions of his own at this point, and yet his focus is on them. And we're going to get that quite a few times in these couple of chapters, that he's prioritizing their needs right now, even though he's kind of facing some pretty horrific stuff and probably actually really needs someone to be there for him. He's actually prioritizing their needs first at this point.
But he recognises he has someone, which he's going to come to as well.
But I think some of this is setting it up, because the someone that he has is the someone that the disciples are also going to need in a really short amount of time.
They are. So he comes to that, you are my friends, which is a different way of a rabbi looking at his takaronas. But, if you do what I command you, and he's just said that is love one another. You do that, he says, you are my friends. No longer do I call you servants. And a rabbi's disciples very often were the people who looked after his needs.
And this isn't the first time where he's talked about I don't remember which week it was, but talking about, being part of the family rather than being servants. So this is kind of in a similar vein, in that it's sort of inviting them into the inner circle. And I kind of find it interesting because he's just given them a really, really strong picture of servant leadership. And now, no longer do I call you servants.
And that no longer suggests that they have been ministering to his needs. But a servant doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of relationship invested in their activity.
They're doing what they have to do. That is their job.
Yes. But now we're talking not to servants, but to friends. And he has brought them into the inner circle. All the things that I heard from my Father I have made known to you.
I also think verse 16 is a strong follow on from this, that, it's not that, you chose me and you qualified kind of thing. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit, that, this is all God's making the first step here.
And Jesus is the one who said to most of them, come, follow me, with one possible exception, who's no longer in the group. But his purpose, I chose you, I appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit. And your fruit should remain or abide.
It's got that sense of abide in it.
Pretty sure it's actually the same root word.
I didn't look that one up.
And growing out of that, so that you should bear fruit, your fruit should remain, so that whatever you might ask the Father in my name, he may give you.
We had some of this in the last chapter as well. We've kind of had three sort of coming around to this point that, whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. Or, if you abide in me, my words abide in you, shall ask whatever you wish shall come to pass. And we're very good at taking the second half there, but he's kind of like in three ways just come back to this and crafted a little bit more. That connection and that, wanting the Father's will is kind of an inherent part of asking for things. It's not just, can I have $1 million?
And in reality, with verse 17, these things I command you, that you love one another. And if we are praying, God, enable me to be a loving blessing to those around me, we're finding ourselves in a position which is where Jesus wanted us to be.
And we're sort of about to transition into the, love is great and, there is joy, but it's not going to be easy sailing. Now, we can't accuse Jesus of a bait and switch here, really. He sort of lays it out that there is going to be downsides here.
That love is going to be demonstrated most when it's hardest to do.
But we've also kind of almost got this comparison point here that the disciples are supposed to be known by their love, and the world is more known by its hatred. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be sometimes worth taking a moment to reflect on that because, looking around the world, it isn't always playing out that way.
Look on social media and, you mess up once and despite all your good deeds, they'll crucify you.
And just, are we known by our love? Because there's some areas in the world, just in sort of general terms, where they can sometimes be a lot better at loving than we are, which it isn't how it's supposed to be. And, as we're starting to talk about, the world hating you and, persecution, some of the times when, Christians tend to jump up and cry persecution most aren't because they have been loving individuals making positive, Jesus talking to the Pharisees, for which of my good deeds are you persecuting me? That not all of the time when we sort of apply these verses, it's necessarily the application that is meant because, if you're kind of being a douche, then it's, if there's kickback, it's not because, well, the world hated me first. It's...
I was stupid.
Yes. And so I think keeping that background of abiding in God, continuing to have God's word abiding in us and that we're supposed to be known by our love really, really needs to be a backdrop for the talking about
the conversation that's happening here.
Happening next.
But he's plain. The world often does hate. And sometimes there are people who are out there that in our minds we think are part of the world, but in fact their actions say that they're not part of it. And Jesus has already said, I've got other sheep. And we're so quick to put people in
our little boxes.
In boxes.
And the other thing that I think we often look past is that, particularly in this space, the source of the greatest persecution in his context was actually the religious people, like the upright good ones who were in charge of, looking after the spiritual needs of their nation.
So persecution is very often good people trying to make other people good rather than bad people trying to make people bad.
Yeah. A lot of the time bad is, but a lot of the time the world really doesn't care. Mm-hmm. You do your thing, whatevs. As long as you're not sort of encroaching on me or dumping hate on me, then whatevs. That we sort of have to be really careful here because that we often have this, they're worldly and they're bad and they'll try and influence me in a bad way, so I need to not associate with them. Or, that some of the ways that we twist this in our thinking is really unhelpful.
Or that person is religious and therefore couldn't possibly be the world.
And particularly in cases of abuse. That there's a lot of abuse that's been, swept under the carpet or ignored or not reported because, they're a good person.
They go to church, they
hold positions of leadership, they do the right things, they're known by the right people, they have good connections, they couldn't possibly moving on. And that, there's real dangers to the ways that this can become twisted in our thinking and become a victim complex when we're actually doing the persecuting more.
And we have to be cautious of those who would try to coerce people by law, by force, by pressure.
And also, we need to not be those people. That, it can be really tempting to say that, to assume that, my beliefs are good ones, that everybody should follow my beliefs and we should, put laws in place to protect the way to make things run the way I think they should be. And that can really go pear-shaped. We shouldn't be the ones doing that coercion.
The worst abuses in history have been done in God's name.
And being very clear here, when Jesus is saying, whatever you ask for in my name, that's not, doing horrible things in Jesus' name, it doesn't justify anything.
So he's got a little bit of a talk here about those who give you a hard time. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world. My way is different. On account of this, the world hates you. Don't expect that they're going to smile your way if you follow his principles.
But at the same time, I think, again, the love really needs to be the forefront here. Because if we're acting in ways that are not loving and then assuming that the world kicking back is because, I'm doing things God's way, then there might be, if that love isn't a component, then big question marks here. Mm-hmm. It also reminds me a little bit like this passage of back in Samuel, where the people are like, we want a king. And Samuel's like, guys, isn't God a good enough king? Like, no, we want it, like, in sort of getting into some of the nationalism. And Samuel's like, I'm not really keen on this, but goes to talk to God. And God says, it's not you they're rejecting, it's actually me. Like, okay, fine, tell them what this is going to cost them, but go and do what they're asking, but recognize that they're not actually rejecting you in this case. Like, Samuel's sort of the last of the judges. It wasn't that necessarily that the people were rejecting Samuel, it's that the people were rejecting God, and Samuel happened to be the one in the middle. And you've almost got that aspect here that, if the world is rejecting you, it's not necessarily you per se. It's because they're rejecting me.
And that certainly comes through. You know, remember the word that I said to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me,
they'll also persecute you. And some of the disciples are going to know that in a really real way very soon.
Mm-hmm. If they kept my word, they'll keep yours. It is a two-way thing. But they will do all these things against you.
On account of my name.
He's preparing his disciples. He's telling them ahead of time.
And again, John is using this sort of as a stepping it forward to a persecuted church, for whom this is also a comfort, really. And it's weird to talk about, you know, you're going to have persecution as a thing of comfort, but it kind of is.
For it to come unexpected is much harder. Okay, so they'll do us on account of my name because they have not known the one having sent me.
Which is, again, a theme that's been all the way through John, that, you know, you don't know me because you don't know the one that sent me.
And we've now got a duplex. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have had sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin.
This reminds me of the end of chapter 9, where we've had the guy that Jesus has just healed from being born blind. And the Pharisees are like, you know, are we also blind? And Jesus responds, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains. It kind of has similar echoes there, that it's growing out of the same idea.
And it's also got links back to abiding in my love being the most important thing. With Jesus having come, they now have no excuse. They've seen his actions, they've heard his teachings. They've chosen not to believe in him, therefore in his Father.
And I think he is going to come back to this and expand it in a little bit more detail in the next chapter. But, you know, he's really nailing that sense of connection here. That, you know, you are connected to me is connected to my Father. And
if you're not connected to my Father, you're not going to be connected to me. And
you know, again, the one hating me hates my Father also. Like, he's making it really clear here.
And those who are hating him would say, we don't hate the Father. So he explains it. If I had not done among them the works that no one else has done, they would not have had sin. But now they have both seen and hated both me and my Father.
There's almost a sense of, you know, you're not judged on what you don't know, but when you know, then there is an accountability. But there's almost sort of echoes of some of the woes that Matthew records.
Or Paul's verse, to him who knows to do good and does it not. To him, it's sin. God doesn't hold people accountable for that which they either don't know or don't have opportunity to know.
But, you know, when he talks about, you know, woe to you, whichever villages he's mentioning at the time, you know, if the miracles that had been done here had been done in you, you would have repented and turned back. And the miracles have been done here. And
I think his contrast was Sodom. If they had had him, they would have repented.
And here, Jerusalem, in general terms, you know, has had him, has seen plenty of evidence.
Has had his teaching.
And for a lot of them, their hearts are remaining hard. Then, you know, that's...
They've got no excuse, as verse 25 says, and he's quoting the Old Testament, that they hated me without cause. In the midst of this, preparing his disciples, he swings into an extension of this discourse, talking about the helper, the one whom he is going to send from the Father.
It's also one of the places where we, like, particularly in these couple of the chapters, where we get a little bit more of a glimpse of the idea of some of the Trinity. In that, you've got the Father and you've got the Son, and then the Helper is going to come, that there's sort of three different entities. But, yeah, particularly in the last chapter and the next chapter, he does a lot of talking about the function of the Holy Spirit and what the Spirit is going to be doing, in and amongst this persecution, amongst the challenging things that are to come, that, they have this promise that the Comforter is going to come.
He's going to come from the Father. He's called the Spirit of Truth.
Which again is the aletheia, the unforgetting we talked about in season 1.
And Jesus had already said, I am the way, the truth. We've aligned that with Jesus. Again, he repeats about it coming forth from the Father.
And then we kind of have a dual witness here that, he will bear witness concerning me and you will also bear witness concerning me because you've been with me from the beginning. That, there's almost a sense of partnership here.
And a flow down. It's come from the Father to me. It's come from the Father to the Spirit. Now you are part of it also. And now he begins to explain why he's gone into this. I have spoken these things to you that you might not fall away.
And he's already, predicted that, well, not predicted, but, told them that Peter is going to fall away. Peter isn't the only one. He already knows kind of what's going to happen in that sense. And yet, I've spoken this to you that you might not fall away. And I think some of that is that you might not stay fallen away. You might get a bit skittish at the beginning, but that that kind of, it doesn't have to be a permanent.
And a total abandoning.
Yeah.
He talks about, they'll put you out of the synagogues. Well, we've already seen that back in chapter 10, was it, where the man born blind. And rather than admit, oh, wow, what a miracle, they unmembered him.
To be fair, Jesus has been kind of shuffled out of his share of synagogues too.
Yes.
But I also kind of think, the end of this, an hour is coming that everybody having killed you will think it is to offer a service to God.
We're doing God a favour.
And we're doing the work of God in getting rid of these people.
And Paul
is kind of one of the first ones that comes to mind. But the worldly persecution that you're going to face isn't always going to be from out there.
Out there often doesn't care.
Yeah, it's the people who believe that they are doing the right thing who can be the most dangerous sometimes.
Yeah, we're giving you a hard time because God told us to.
And it is for your benefit and reproaching you so that you may become a better person. Just sort of, there are so many ways of being spiritually abusive that kind of look a bit like this. And I think he's providing comfort for the people who are being abused by the system. Yes, there is sort of a little bit of a warning on the flip side to not be that abuser. But he's dealing with people who are going to be abused by the system, and a lot of the stuff that is claimed in the Bible tends to be, particularly from a white Western perspective, used in terms of a dominance rather than a understood that the context of a lot of the Bible is, an occupied people, the people who are not free, a people who are persecuted, that, it's a cultural thing that doesn't always carry across. And so we read some of these things and we don't really understand what that kind of persecution is from the terms of, the dominant group in society.
And it would seem that all this comes because we haven't got a true picture of God.
And maybe not abiding.
Maybe not even clean. But certainly in this case, they don't know either the Father or Jesus.
But again, we have I have said these things to you so that.
He's already told us that, but some things have to be said and said and said.
And the other thing is, yes, so that you might not fall away, but here he's sort of extending that so that when the hour comes, you can remember that I said this to you. So
it's not important right now,
yeah.
But the time is coming when you need to have this.
And I didn't say it to you from the beginning because I've been with you. That, this is going to be relevant because I'm not always going to be with you, and that's soon.
There's a time coming when I'm not going to be here. At that time, you are going to need this. And this is a very gracious, thoughtful way that he's caring for people.
And, he sort of goes right on, but now I go to the one having sent me. And none of you ask, where are you going? And you've kind of got this, because I said these things to you, sorrow has filled your heart, that they're kind of focused on the road needs, not...
And this almost grows out of let not your heart be troubled back in chapter 14.
And he leads with, let not your heart be troubled, peace I leave with you, before he comes into this. It's not a sort of tacking the platitude on at the end. He leads with those.
And whether the sorrow is because he's leaving and the manner in which he's leaving, or the fact that he's going back to the Father.
Well, I think at this point, the real understanding that they can only have is this sense of, wait, he's not always going to be here. I don't want to be in a world where he's not here. I don't want him to go.
And so he has to say to them in verse 7, I tell you the truth, it's profitable for you that I should go away.
This is a good thing.
There's no way they can see that.
Because, they're sort of seeing him going away as a bad thing, and he's sort of trying to help them understand that, the going away is a good thing. This is part of a good process. It might not always be pleasant, but it's a good thing.
In fact, if he doesn't go, the helper will not come. But he says, if I go, I'll send him.
I'll make sure he comes.
And that's so interesting. The one who sent me, the one who sent me, the one who sent me is what he's been...
And now he's jumping into that role as the one who is sending.
I am sending, I will send him to you.
And you've also got kind of the aspect of sending the disciples as well. That as the Father has sent me, so send I you.
And when he comes, there's some convicting of the world.
We've kind of got a three-way concept here. And there's sort of concepts that have been flowing through John a little bit, but the sin, righteousness, judgment. So, having come, he will convict the world concerning sin, concerning righteousness, and concerning judgment. We often don't kind of look at it in those terms. But then he goes on to sort of expand that concerning sin indeed, because they do not believe in me.
And that really fits back into that, if I hadn't come, they would have no sin. If I hadn't done all these works, they would have. But because he has come and they haven't believed.
And even just that the sin, that the heart of the sin itself is the not believing.
That's the great sin. We sometimes like to make other things the worst possible sin.
And attach all sorts of stigma to, this is worse sin and this is not so bad sin.
And look, there are things that people do that are sin. We're not denying that.
But I think sometimes we have a bit of a tendency to have our own hierarchy of sin. And here Jesus is essentially,
And your sins are always worse than my sins.
clearly. But, it's sort of, they're all tied in together. So we've got the sin because they do not believe in me. Righteousness because I go away to the Father and you behold me no more. And concerning judgment because the ruler of this world has been judged. It's kind of a really interesting grouping of concepts there.
That grow right out of his mission, his ministry. And he flicks straight back. I have many things to say to you. But you are not able to bear them now.
Given how many times he's had to repeat things and explain things, we're not moving at the fastest pace as far as teaching.
But there will be another time when there's a teachable moment. And when the Spirit of truth shall come, and that's a repetition of what we've already seen, he will guide you into all truth.
And this, kind of this low-key concept that as you are ready, he will be there to guide you. That, Jesus could be sort of like, guys, I'm only here for a couple more days. I know you don't get this, but, start taking notes. It's gently revealed as the disciples are ready for it. The role of the Spirit of truth is to be kind of guide them in that process.
And if this is the role of the Spirit, it ought to also guide us. Sometimes we want to give people truth. Whether they are ready or not. It's like kids, coming ready or not. I've got this truth, and if you're ready for it, well, here it is. But if you're not ready for it, here it is.
And there's even sort of an aspect of, just because this is the truth we've arrived at doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't still space that truth needs to be grown and evolved a little bit in terms of our understanding. So just because, I have the truth is a little bit almost arrogant in terms of we need to treat that cautiously.
Truth needs to be held in humility.
And even that aspect, we're getting into some of the similar language here that, he will not speak from himself, but whatever he hears, he will speak.
These are words Jesus has just said about himself and his relationship to the Father. I don't say my own words, I say what. And now the Spirit is not speaking on his own behalf, he's speaking what he hears.
And because he's drawing the disciples into this, they are also not speaking on their own behalf, but speaking what they hear and doing what they're told to do. That they're being drawn into this relationship as well.
And so just as Jesus is preparing them for the future, the Spirit will also prepare them for the future.
And we're coming back to glory here.
He, the Spirit, will glorify me. For he's going to take that which is mine and disclose it to you.
Which becomes bigger, I think, with the next verse, that all things that the Father has are mine.
And that is an enormous...
That's a lot. And that, because of this, I said that he will take that from what is mine and I disclose it to you. So it's everything that the Father has is mine, and what is mine...
The Spirit's going to take that...
and give to you.
It's enormous.
And then you got just this little sentence tucked in there.
A little while, and you'll behold me no longer. And again a little while, and you'll see me.
I suspect this might have been another one of these sleeper things. I mean, we see the disciples' reaction in a minute, but the kind of, wait, he's going away and then he's coming back.
And does this relate to, I go to prepare a place for you, or is it before that?
Well, they don't actually have all the information to understand this yet.
And they are very plain. What's this that he says to us? a little while and you do not behold me, and again a little while and you'll see me. They've heard him, they can repeat the words. And because I'm going to the Father, they're saying, what is this that he says?
I kind of find it interesting that at this point, there's sort of like, you know, Jesus says a thing and they're sort of, do you have any, I have no idea. What? And Jesus is like, knowing that they wanted to ask, answers the question they hadn't actually asked him, because, you know, when your teacher gives you a confusing thing, clearly the thing is to, do you understand it? I don't understand it. This is weird, instead of actually asking the teacher.
And Jesus picks it up. Do you inquire among one another concerning this, that I said, a little while and you don't behold me? And
sometimes he has to voice the questions we're not brave enough to ask.
so he repeats them repeating him.
But then we get a truly, truly.
That I missed. I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You'll be grieved. It's fairly strong language. But your grief will turn to joy.
And it's sort of, it's almost doing that tripleting thing. And we get a sort of even stronger image in the next verse. You know, the woman has pain when she's giving birth because her hour has come. And he's been talking about his hour has come. But when she brings forth the child, she remembers the tribulation no longer on account of the joy that the man has been born into the world. And just sort of setting this up for, it's going to be hard and excruciating for a little while, but it's going to be okay. You know, it's going to pale in terms of what's coming afterwards.
I will see you again and your heart will rejoice and no one will take your joy from you. There's going to be darkness before there's light.
And he's really, really trying hard to set them up to not completely crumble when...
He's preparing them.
Yes.
As they walk the streets of Jerusalem, he knows what's coming. And in that day, you will ask of me nothing. Another truly, truly. Whatever you may ask the Father in my name, he will give it you. We've already really talked about that.
And, you know, it's one of these growing concepts that's introduced and then it sort of keeps coming back and morphing and crafting kind of almost.
Yeah. Until now, you've asked nothing in my name. You know, you've just travelled around with me,
Well, they haven't needed to.
But now they are going to ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full.
And I kind of, you know, I think we need to understand the beginning by the end as well as the ending by the beginning, that, you know, the result of asking and receiving is a fuller understanding and a fuller experience of joy, that it's not just, you know, ask and you will receive. That the joy is really connected in there, but it's a little bit like the abide. You know, you've got to abide for the asking to become relevant in this case.
And we said the abiding was a two-way relationship. That this is not being a passive follower. It's not just walking along with him and accompanying him. It's being engaged in what's important to him, asking in his name. And we've talked about joy a couple of times, and here it is.
And again. I kind of almost think that he's bringing it forward again in terms of sometimes we can't really understand joy until we've known suffering. And they're about to know a whole lot of suffering, but staying in that connection and, you know, as a result of coming out the other end of, the joy is going to be way fuller than it could ever have been if they hadn't.
And then he's a little bit plainer. Look, I've spoken these things to you in allegories. I've used figures of speech. An hour is coming when I'll speak no more in allegories. I'll report to you plainly concerning the Father. In that day, you will ask in my name. And I do not say that I'll implore the Father for you.
I actually kind of find this really interesting. It's something that I think can be really easily skipped over. But, there's plenty of talk about, asking in Jesus' name. And he's saying, particularly 26:27, I do not say that I will implore the Father for you. I do not need to. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and believe that I came from God. I'm not having to kind of twist the Father's arm to get what you want.
That's an amazing phrase. The Father himself loves you. Sometimes people get the idea that God's mad at us.
And it's just sort of looking for
Jesus
reasons
comes and sort of strokes him and says,
settle down, it's okay.
Calm down, Dad. This is John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But now Jesus is taken for the disciples. The Father himself loves you.
And it's almost cutting out the middleman in a sense. In that as the Father has loved me, I have loved you. But this is the Father himself loves you.
You don't need intermediaries. The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came forth from God.
And he's really pushed this connection between him and the Father, but what we kind of get specifically mentioned here that is sort of more implied in all the other places is that if Jesus loves them, God loves them too. That connection is on that level as well. And I'm really, really glad we have this passage.
And he ties it up in verse 28. I came forth from the Father. I'm representing the Father. What you're seeing in me...
It's him.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He loves you. I came forth from the Father. I've come into the world. Again, I leave the world and go to the Father. And his disciples say, oh, now you speak in openness and you don't speak allegory. Now we know that you know all things. Yeah, you read our thoughts.
But you've also, they're kind of restating it as sort of, yeah, we get it. And I think, I think I understand. And a couple of days later, they're, oh, I understand. But, just the way that Jesus responds to them, oh, now you believe. An hour is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to their own, and you will leave alone. All this is great, but you're about to be scattered. I'm not alone because the Father is with me, but I have spoken these things to you so that you may have peace. These are the people who are about to abandon him. He's saying, I'm speaking to these things to you so you can have peace.
And it's only a couple of hours away from that happening.
Yeah. And this idea of, in the world you will have trouble, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Again, this is one that we sort of like to take out of context a lot. But, he's acknowledging that very soon these, abiding in him and I would lay down my life for you and all of these things are going to be kind of come to complete failure.
This is where he finished his discourse in the upper room. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. And as they are about to go into the Garden of Gethsemane, he's repeating these words.
And that idea that, even falling away now, it's not permanent. And I think that's one of the things that saved Peter, really.
He's told them, you are going to be scattered.
He has told Peter specifically, you are going to deny me. He's told the disciples, you're going to be scattered. But he keeps reiterating that
the door is open.
The door is open. The love is still there. That, even now I know that I'm going to be persecuted. You're going to fail me. That's not going to be permanent. Peace.
And so what's he going to do with this group of troubled disciples? In the next chapter, he's going to stop and he's going to pray for them. John doesn't include a lot of the Gethsemane
he doesn't. There's
but
basically
he records
no Gethsemane.
Jesus' prayer for the disciples, that their faith will not be lost.
And then through them, all the believers.
And that's where we're going to go in the next episode of Working the Word. We're going to examine this prayer that Jesus prayed for his disciples and for those of us who would follow them.
As a result.
And we invite you to join us next time for another episode of Working the Word, exploring the Gospel of John.